I'd like to thank our sponsors for 2025. The Shirim has sponsored Leilu Nishmais Brana Bas Brandit and Zelig Ben Kalman. We're very, very grateful for that ongoing sponsorship. Okay, let's talk about this topic. We've never discussed this topic before. It's a long source sheet, and actually the sources I really want to focus on are from page 8 onwards. So I will start at the beginning. You don't have to flick there just yet. But we have spoken before about these first few sources, but it was a long time ago when we talked about vaccination. And many of you may remember the COVID epidemic. You may have tried to put it out of your head. But we talked a lot in the early days about vaccination when Israel was early in adopting vaccination, and there was something of a debate, halachically as well. But I'd like to review some of those sources. They're very important sources, and they apply very much to this topic too. The main source we'll see is a tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein, which we've not looked at before together, which we'll see in detail, and that was one of a group of tshuvas in 1973. So let's make a start with this. I want to look today at the issue of cannabis and marijuana. They really are the same thing. We'll talk a little bit about why they have two different names. And the halachic angle on this, from a perspective both of medical use, which is not really a shaila, but also from recreational use. And I put some statistics here, a little bit at the beginning about smoking. Israel still has a pretty high tobacco smoking rate. But in terms of cannabis, it's pretty much off the charts. Before March 2017, recreational cannabis use was illegal in Israel. And in theory, people could be charged with an offense and pay heavy fines or imprisonment, although in practice it was almost never done. A survey in 2017 in Israel, even when it was illegal, technically speaking, to smoke cannabis recreationally, revealed that 27% of Israelis between 18 and 65 had consumed cannabis in some way in the previous year, which was the highest rate in the whole world, interestingly. The next was, I put here, Iceland at 18%. I don't know what happens in Iceland, probably not very much. But I don't know why they need to calm down in Iceland, but maybe they do. And then the US, 16%. But you see that Israel is leading that statistic, and it's not necessarily a good thing. From 2018, pharmacies were allowed to sell cannabis for medical use under a special pilot program. And then in 2019, cannabis was decriminalized in Israel for everyone from the age of 18 and over when it's used in private. This has now become a very widespread thing. I don't know about you, but depending on how many teenagers are in town on Shabbos and Motzei Shabbos, I can smell different things going around different neighborhoods when you walk around Yerushalayim. Medical cannabis for sure is very widespread now, and there are, I put here, 137,000 licensed medical cannabis patients in 2024, and roughly 3,000 in Israel, it's a small country, get added every single month. In the US, 24 states plus DC and a couple of other territories now have legalized recreational cannabis, and 38 states have legalized medical cannabis. So we will have a look at this today. There are some interesting sources that come up. We'll see how they apply and how they may be, dependent on the medical assessment here. At the beginning, I'd like to share something a little bit fun. I'm not sure that I really find it very compelling, but there are those who really want to say that cannabis is right there in the psukim in Sefer Shmot coming up in a few weeks. And they point to the pasuk in number 1 here, where they're putting together the spices to make the anointing oil, the shemen mishcha. And God says, "Va'ata kach lecha besamim." Besamim rosh. A lot of people read this in the korbanos. Take for yourself these besamim, these herbs, and of course besamim and samim is the same, basic word. Mardror, there's a certain myrrh. V'chamesh me'od, 5 mayas of that. V'kinmon bosem. Kinmon obviously is related to cinnamon, sweet-smelling or scented cinnamon. Okay, mechatziso chamisha matayim. Okay, so half of that previous amount. Uknei bosem. Now, what is this knei bosem? Is knei bosem related in any way linguistically, philologically, to cannabis? Knei bosem or cannabis? So the answer is probably not. But I brought you at the bottom Rav Aryeh Kaplan, who has a special focus on these things with pictures. He talks about what cinnamon is, kinamon, and then he talks about kinebosim, which he associates with other things. But he does say at the end there are some who associate this based on the Septuagint and other readings with the English, Greek, cannabis, etc., the hemp plant, which we're going to talk about soon. But there is a suggestion there. Rashi in the top of page number 2 just says, Kanei bosem just means any sticks that have scent, as opposed to sticks that don't have scent, and it's got nothing to do with cannabis directly. Later on in Yeshayahu, for example, Yeshayahu rebukes the people and says, "V'loi kanita liba kesef." God's saying to them, "Loi kanita liba kesef kane." You didn't spend money to buy this kana. You're meant to be using this kana bosem, which we had in the temple. You didn't bother. You didn't bother, you didn't make the effort. And the Radak says, the reason is, and this is why we're interested in it today, in number 4, this kaneh, which Yeshayahu is criticizing the people, they didn't bother to go and buy for the temple. Kaneh bosem, this is kaneh bosem, shehaya b'keteris, which was in the incense. The ama b'kaneh lo kanita, why does it say you didn't buy this special spice? Because this is not indigenous, says the redactor, Eretz Yisrael. Ki im al yidei kinyan, ki me'eretz rechoka haya. It was only available on the spice trade. You had to pick it up from a long way away. Eretz rechoka haya balahem. It came to them from far away. K'moshe kosav kana mitova aretz merachak. The Metzudas David disagrees. I don't know whether cannabis was ever indigenous to Israel. I don't think it was. It's certainly very broadly grown today. And as I said, it's probably not the cannabosum that we're talking about anyway. The Rambam, interestingly, says in number 6, in the halachas, these are halachas we don't get a chance to review with each other very much, the halachas of putting together the clay mikdash, the Beis HaMikdash. So, of course, he goes through all the different spices that you need to make the ketoret, and he says in number 6, U'kanei bosem. What is kanei bosem? Heim hakanim hadakim. It's very thin sticks. Keteven, almost like straw. Keteven ha'adumim, like red, crimson kind of straw, which again doesn't sound particularly like the cannabis plant. Haba'im ye hodu, and it comes from India. It's on the spice trade. You have to pick it up on the spice trade. And doctors use this, interesting medically, in some kind of balsam. So maybe it has some kind of medical use as well. So I can't promise you that Kanei Bosem is cannabis, even though I brought you some of the sources there of the people in America. Some people really swear by this. I did a little bit of research on the internet. I found an interesting conference a few years ago, which was recorded of various different people speaking about this. The conference was rather cleverly called OUisrael High, which I thought was an excellent name. When I pointed this out to one of my students, they said, no, I think you'll find that was a joint conference, which was even better because she wasn't even a dad to use a dad joke of that kind. But I can't promise that any of this is really compelling. But the Rambam says what it is there. There is a Mishnah in Kilayim, and the different Chazal sources talk a lot about this, something called Cannabis. Now, Cannabis is definitely the same family as cannabis, because cannabis means canvas. And canvas is a kind of cloth, which of course does come exactly from the same name as cannabis, because it's a cloth which is from the hemp plant. And I brought you in the footnote there how cannabis and hemp are related. In fact, the cannabis is only really a drug, if you like, for recreational use if it has a certain level of this chemical. I talked about this in the footnote here, tetrahydrocannabinol, which was actually isolated and identified by an Israeli researcher in the 1960s in the Weizmann Institute. So for any of those people out there who want to boycott everything that originally came from Israel, they're going to have to stop smoking cannabis as well. They might not be too happy if you tell them that. But he identified and isolated this particular molecule which is causing the mental effect there. But I brought you other things there as well. But this cannabis is actually mentioned. For example, look in number 7, says the Mishnah in Maseches Kilayim, Haita sadehu zerua cannabis. If you had this plant, the hemp plant, sown in your field, or luf, or another similar plant. Lo yehei zoreya, you're not allowed to sow something else, uba'al gabehim, on top of them. She'einam oisim ela l'shlosh shanim. Because these particular plants, cannabis and other things, they take a while to germinate, they take a few years, and don't think, oh, well, there's nothing going on in my field for the next year or two anyway, I'll just sow something else here in the meantime. No, because that's kilayim. You're mixing all the seeds together, mixing all the grasses together. There is something under there growing, it's just not growing as fast as you can see it, but nevertheless you can't do it. So this cannabis is definitely identified. There is even a conspiracy theory that the original people who tried to ban cannabis were actually cloth barons that didn't want the cloth, hemp, to replace the other cloths that they were producing because they were worried that people would switch over to using hemp for everything, and therefore they tried to ban the plants, and it wasn't anything to do with the smoking of the cannabis. So I can't guarantee that that's true. I heard that as one of the conspiracy theories that goes around. But cannabis definitely was a plant that was used. I discovered a Tosefta. The research for this was really actually very interesting. The Tosefta talks about sheish. Now, sheish, again, coming up in Sefer Shemot, sheish is linen. Now, sheish was one of the important ingredients that was used in the Big Day Kahuna, and also sheish v'argaman, etc., and also in the furnishings of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Tosefta says here in number 8, sheish ze pishtan. This is linen, okay, flax. Heviu min hakanbus, but if you brought it from canbus, psula, it doesn't work. It's not a good substitute. And there is, just flip over to page 3. I'm doing this quickly because it's not really the core material. There is even a manuscript version of this particular Tosefta that I just quoted you, a 14th century manuscript that actually writes the word not cannabis but cannabis, which is quite interesting. So it could be that was even a spelling that was used in classic rabbinic literature for this plant, cannabis, etc. Very interesting. I brought you also, because I think it was Eliezer ben Yehuda's Yortzeit yesterday or the day before, something like this. It's not something I celebrate or commemorate specifically. But I brought you from the Academia Lelashon HaIvrit, which I always think is extremely ironic that they couldn't think of a better name than Academia for an institution that is promoting the use of Hebrew words only. But okay, that's one of life's ironies. So they wrote here cannabis be'ivrit kanbos milara, or chashish, and of course they associate this with hashish as well. Hashish is based on an Arabic word. And of course, it's connected with the word assassin, hashishin, people who got themselves high on drugs. And we've seen this very tragically. Sometimes people, in order to be able to do the horrific things that they do, drug themselves so that they're not going to be restricted in the way that they're going to act. But here it brings it down as canbos, etc. And there's a whole section related to Jules Verne, which I didn't bring you because I'm not sure how interested you are in Jules Verne. But 80 days, wasn't it? What was Jules Verne? 80 days? Around the World in 80 Days. Apparently, the original Hebrew translation of that relates to this as well. Anyway, enough of that. In number 10, I brought you the Shulchan Aruch, who brings down cannabis as one of the wicks that you are allowed to use on Shabbat for your Shabbat candles, because of course it's wicks that take the flame well, as opposed to the flame just dances around them and goes out. You need a good flame for Shabbos candles, so you won't be tempted to move it. And cannabis is one of those things, and I brought you the Mishnah Berurah that questions that. Therefore, cannabis is a very real thing. They did, and I'll just leave this section with this point, in Tel Arad, a few years ago, they discovered an altar, which looks as though it had been covered over very quickly by people who were trying to hide it. From the time of around Chizkiyahu HaMelech, which actually makes a lot of sense because there were reforms to try and get rid of all the bamot, all the private altars, and it doesn't look as though this altar fell into disuse and just fell apart. It looks as though it was covered very quickly. And they even found the substance which was on the little altar that they'd been burning before they covered it over, and indeed it was cannabis. Cannabis actually mixed with some kind of animal dung so that it would burn, so there would be a scent of cannabis floating around this private altar. So it seems pretty clear that there were people using this in the First Temple period, whether it was illicit worship or official worship, they were using this. Okay, for our question now really is, okay, so what's the story today? Leaving aside the biblical roots of cannabis or not, and the real issue here is whether it's a danger to health. And we'll see that this is true, of course, of smoking, tobacco, but it's also true of cannabis, and it's more of a controversy when it comes to cannabis. We'll see in a minute. Most poskim have very clearly paskened and continue to do so that using cannabis for recreational use is prohibited. And there are a number of reasons that they bring this down. We're going to look at the entire tshuva of Rav Moshe. It's not a very long tshuva. But in 1973, Rav Moshe Feinstein was asked this tshuva. We'll talk about where that actual shaila came from soon. But I brought other poskim, and I brought you down in the footnotes the actual language that they use. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, here Rav Chaim David Yosef Weiss of Antwerp, Rav Herschel Schechter. I brought you a reference here to Rav Herschel Schechter's tshuva. He has a long tshuva where you can read it, you can print it off from TORAH.org. He clearly says it's prohibited, and we'll talk maybe about some of the reasons that he gives. Rav Yaakov Ariel as well clearly says it's prohibited. So there doesn't really seem to be a shaila, halacha lemaisa, of most of the major poskim. We're not talking about medical marijuana here, we're talking about the recreational use. But most poskim seem to say clearly that, not all, but most that it is prohibited. The reason is going to be, is it dangerous? And actually, many, many doctors will say it is dangerous. And it's more dangerous than people think, especially when it's being smoked by teenagers. My daughter-in-law, who is in medical school, said they're not clear exactly why this statistic is, but it is a very clear statistic, that young people under the age of 20 who have smoked marijuana more than 50 times, which is not that many from me, because people start doing this at the age of 13, 14, 15, are 6 times more likely to suffer from schizophrenia later in life. And again, they're 6 times more likely to suffer from schizophrenia. And schizophrenia says very clear link that they found, and they're not sure exactly what the reason is. But that's just one of a number and some of these are disputed. Obviously, I'm not a doctor. I'm not here to give you medical advice. Please consult your local medical advisor. But let's look at some of these sources as to how that works. The rabbis take looking after your health very seriously. Look at number 11, very interesting source here. Amalei Rav Huna le Rabba Brei. So Rav Huna was schmoozing with his son, Rabbi, and he says to him, "My time Rav Chizda. Why have you stopped going to Rav Chizda's shir? You know, you were going to Rav Chizda and you stopped. The Mechadid in Shmaisei, he's so analytically sharp. It's such a great shir. Why did you stop going?" So Amalei, the son, answers to him, "Why should I go? Why am I going to go to the shir? I go to the shir and he schmoozes about like regular things, not particularly Toradic topics. He's telling me all sorts of things. I'm not interested in going for that." So Amali, for example, he said to us, I went to the shir, he said, if you're going to go to use the bathroom, to use the toilet, don't go too quickly, and don't force yourself too much to go to the bathroom. And why do I need to listen to this? I'm going for a shir, I'm not going for some kind of medical advice. So the father, Amalei, says to the son, he's giving you health advice? And you consider that like minor, inconsequential stuff? All the more so you should go. I didn't even know he was giving you that kind of guidance. That's even more important than a sharp analytical shir. You've of course got to go. That is a core mitzvah. You should be going to that, said the father to the son. And this indeed is a mitzvah. The Gemara brings it down in number 12. Rabbi Nassan Omer, Minayin shelo yigdal adam kelev ra b'toch beiso. Why should you not have a rabid dog, a vicious dog, nearby in your house or around your house that could bite people? And you shouldn't have a ladder in your house, which is a rickety ladder that could, God forbid, fall apart. Someone could fall off it. And he quotes a pasuk, Talmud, don't bring blood on your house. Don't have dangerous things. And this is actually part of a series of psukim. I brought you in number 13. Be very, very careful with your life. And it talks then about Sinai, and on a pshat level, it's talking more about hashkafa, but you'll see that the Gemara clearly takes it as being careful with physical life. And then a few psukim later, v'nishmartem ma'od lenafsheseichem. Ma'od is a big word. The Torah doesn't say ma'od just for fun. You must be very careful in looking after your lives. And actually, Chazal bring this down in a very interesting episode in Brachas. If you look in number 14, Tan Rabbanon, Masi b'chasid echad shehaya mitpalel b'derech. There was one chassid. Now, interesting, he was a chassid. He was someone who wanted to do extra, to do more, to go further. He wanted to take on the stuff that he didn't even need to take on. And he was davening. Ba Hegmon Echad, one of the local Cossacks, or not Cossacks, but one of the Roman leaders came, a soldier, a general came. Ba Hegmon Echad v'nasan lo shalom, and he says, hello Jew. V'lo yichsi lo shalom, and he didn't respond to him because he was in the middle of Shemona Esrei. So himtin lo yad desaim. So the soldier waited till he finished tefillah of his whole tefillah. Reika. He said to him, "You empty, foolish person." He gives him a whole share. It says in your Torah, be very careful. And then it says, when I gave you a shalom, you didn't answer. That was terrible. If I cut your head off right here and right now, beside with a sword, who could blame me? You can't take your life in your hands like that and not respond. It's pikuach nefesh. You have a mitzvah doraisa. Yes.
It's like the people who walk on the street with their phones.
Mm.
Don't look where they go.
Right. They've got bumps on the head when they walk into. Right. And more people are doing this. I see people walking across roads on their phones, pushing babies.
Right.
On it's unbelievable. But okay, we all get addicted to the phones. Yes. And that's what we're doing. Okay. So we'll get to drinking soon. The Shulchan Aruch rules very clearly that this is indeed a Torah mitzvah. If you look in number 15, if you leave your roof, and people go up on the roof and it doesn't have a proper fence, Bitel mitzvah saseh, you are breaking a positive Torah mitzvah, and you are breaking a negative Torah mitzvah. You can't bring blood into your house. Anything that could be life endangering in some way, mitzvahs asiro, you have to get rid of it. You have to watch out for it. And you have to take very good care to avoid it. And he brings these psukim. So there's no question this is a Torah mitzvah. Interestingly, it's not actually recorded in the 613. People often say to me when you mention a mitzvah and say it's not in the 613, they go, why is it not in the 613? The answer is lots and lots of Torah mitzvahs are not in the Tariag mitzvahs. It doesn't actually change their status at all, which leads to the question why do I even need to know which are the Tariag mitzvahs if it doesn't really make any difference halachically whether they're in or whether they're out? And that's a good question, maybe about categorization, conceptualization of the mitzvahs, what do they fit under, meaning you'd never get to the number 613 unless you really, really try very hard. If you guys, maybe when you've got nothing else to do one day, open up the Chumash at the beginning and count how many times it says do this or don't do that. You'll never get to 613. There's thousands and thousands and thousands. So this is clearly a Torah mitzvah. It's brought down, even though it's not in the 613. And the Beragola brought you his closing words on the Shulchan Aruch. I'm not going to read them inside. In 16, he says, because God has given you the miracle of life so that you can use every minute of life in order to do the right thing, build the world, and grow and connect with God and Olam Haba, you can't throw that back in God's face. He says that's what you're doing if you're not looking after your health. You're throwing that back, and there's no greater apikoursis than that. If God gave you a gift of that magnitude, to throw it back is not okay. Is very not okay. And we don't go after the Rav. I brought you in 17. We don't say, it'll probably be okay. 8 out of 10 people who climb these ladders manage just fine. No, nonsense. It's a rickety ladder. You can't have it. However, there are all sorts of things we do in life which are dangerous, and we do them anyway. For example, the Gemara says very clearly, if you cross a dangerous desert and you survive, then you have to bench gomel. If you go over the sea, because it's dangerous in the sea. Well, if it's dangerous, why are you going? What do you mean you have to bench gomel? The halacha should be, you're not allowed to cross a desert. It's dangerous. Clearly, you are allowed to cross a desert, because that's one of the things you say bench gomel on. So how do I know what is dangerous and I still can do, and what is dangerous and I can't do? And in fact, there are 3 clear categories, and again, I'm not going to get into them in great detail, but we looked at them a little bit many years ago when we looked at the vaccination. These are the 3 categories. Imminent and present dangers are prohibited on a Torah level, and we'll see what they are right now. Low but significant risks are prohibited on a rabbinic level, and dangerous things that have risk but everybody in society does and just accepts that risk as part of the risk of just living, they are permitted. And we'll see what they are, and we'll have to see where cannabis might fit into this. Let me just look at a few sources with you. So the Rambam brings these examples of the Torah prohibitions. So number 18. Echad gag, whether it's a roof without a fence. Ve'echad kol davar sheyesh bo sakana, anything which is dangerous, danger to life. V'roi sheyichshel bo adam, it's possible people might fall into that. V'yamus, and they might die. Kagayin shehaya loy be'er, you have a hole in your garden, you have a well or bore, or you have a pit. B'chatzeiro, in your courtyard, in your shetach there. Ben sheyesh be'em mayim, ben she'ein be'em mayim, whether it's got water, it hasn't got water. Chayiv la'asos lehen chulya gevah asarat tfachim. It has to have some kind of offensive asarat tfachim. Meaning, what if it's, it's only a hole that's, 10, 11 tfachim deep? Oh, it won't be so dangerous if someone falls in. No. Anything over 10 tfachim, there's a danger to life. You have to have a barrier for that. You have to make sure that people won't fall in. V'chein, kol michshel sheyesh bo sakanas nefashos, mitzvahs aseh la'asiru lisham imenu lizar b'davar yafe yafe. And he says yafa yafa. And again, the Rambam is not prone to exaggeration. When he says yafa yafa, you have to do it really, really well. This is what he's talking about. So that's for sure. That would be things like leaving exposed wires, where electrical wires, leaving kids near a pool, swimming pool when there's no fence near the pool. These are things that people should definitely, obviously, not do. Unfortunately, some people do, and could well include walking across the road with looking at your phone at the same time. Now, what about lower risk? So, number 20, harbed varim. There are other things, says the Rambam. Asru chacham mipnei sheyesh behem sakanas nefashos. They are prohibited, okay, because they are dangerous. V'chol ha'odei aleim ve'omer hareini mesaken ba'atzmi. And someone who says, okay, I'm prepared to take the risk. It's fine. Umala acherim alai. Why are you getting involved in my life? Leave me alone. It's not your life. It's my life. Alai bakach. Or any makpid al kach, or I'm not bothered about this particular risk. Makim oisa makas mardas. Makas mardas is rabbinic lashes. So there's something different about these prohibitions, these issues, because they're not Torah prohibitions, they're rabbinic prohibitions. And he gives some examples. Lo yaniach adam piv ala silon u'golech mayim v'yishter. Don't go down, drink water coming out of a pipe, because you're thirsty. Who knows where the water's come from? Pramistama, it's probably okay. Yeah, but it might not be okay. Lo yishte belayla min anaros. Don't drink from a pond at night. Umin agamim, or from a lake, from a pond. Shema yivla aluki. You might swallow a creepy crawly, and he's not worrying about the kashrus. You might swallow something which is dangerous. Lo yishte mayim agulim. You can't drink from water which is exposed. Shema shata behem mehem nachash, because a snake might have drunk from. These are low-level risks, but they're serious enough that Chazal said no. Look at some of the examples in the Shulchan Aruch in number 21. We're not worried about the snakes today because there are no snakes, going into water that is exposed. But the Shulchan Aruch gives other examples. He says, don't put money in your mouth. I remember when I was a kid, my father was always very makpid. Never put money in your mouth. It's tempting, sometimes you're trying to get things out of your pocket, you put something in your mouth. It says never put money on your mouth. And I brought you a little footnote about how filthy money is and how many germs are living on your money. So once you read that, you'll want to use a credit card, and they're probably not much better. There could be bacteria, some kind of dried spittle here from someone who has a contagious disease. Don't keep food under your armpit. If you're keeping it to just, warm it up, or you can't help. It's not hygienic. It's very sweaty there. Don't keep food under your bed. And that's really a spiritual danger, keeping food under your bed. But he says it's a spiritual danger that could have physical implications. And the Ramah gives other examples. You can't have a knife, an exposed knife, which someone could trip and fall on top of the knife, etc., etc. And the key with all of those is that they are risks to health, but they are lower level risks to health, but they're nevertheless things that you can avoid and that you should avoid. And they are rabbinic prohibitions rather than Torah prohibitions, but they are still prohibited. One of the things we discussed back in the day is, does that include having a vaccination? Because the Ramah says, if there's an epidemic coming to your town, get out before the epidemic comes. You have a rabbinic mitzvah to get out of the town. So maybe that means vaccinating yourself also before the epidemic happens. We talked about that. You can get those online, etc. But then, and perhaps the most interesting of all, is these things that we do, but they're not healthy, but we kind of just, okay, you can't think about everything. God runs the world. Well, you're going to tell me I can't eat high cholesterol food, and I can't eat fatty this, and I can't eat meat anymore, and I can't eat this, and I can't eat that. Okay, people get sick, but not everybody gets sick. How are you going to work this out? So 22, says the Rambam, there is this third category. Since your body has to be healthy, shalem, and functioning properly, midarchei Hashem, that is part of the darchei Hashem. That is a religious obligation. You can't function spiritually if you're sick. You have to avoid things which are bad for your body, and only do things which are healthy, etc., etc. Don't eat, don't overeat. The first one on his list. Don't eat other than when you really need to eat. Don't drink unless you really need to drink. And don't delay going to the bathroom even a minute. If you've got to go, you've got to go. And he talks about this a lot. The Rambam in his medical advice says that most illness, in his opinion, okay, I'm not telling you to go to a 12th century physician for medical advice, but he says most illnesses happen because of two things. Number one, people eat too much. He says number two, people don't go to the bathroom enough, and they eat the wrong kind of food, and they're constipated, etc. He really feels that is the two key things. So Rav Moshe Feinstein in a 1981 tshuva has a famous tshuva about smoking cigarettes. And there famously he says that he doesn't think smoking cigarettes in 1981 was in either of the first two categories. He doesn't think it's a Torah prohibition. He doesn't think it's a rabbinic prohibition. He thinks it's a danger to health, which is normally accepted by most people in society. Now, many of his family, Rav Moshe Tendler, who was his son-in-law, said, yeah, but his position hardened on this as the evidence hardened. In 1981, I like to mention this recently, if you remember, people were smoking everywhere, even in the 80s. There was non-smoking on the plane and smoking on the plane and everything. And we didn't think everything smelled of cigarette smoke because we were used to it a lot more. I remember my grandparents used to smoke a lot, and at some point they gave up around about probably this kind of time, maybe a little earlier. It was a very common thing. And in this tshuva he says here, and I just want to pick out a couple of lines, he says, he quotes this line, which we're going to see in the Gemara in a second, from the Gemara Nida, Shomer Pesayim Hashem. God protects those who are simple. He says in Shabbos, in Nida, these Gemaras are talking about things which are dangerous, but people do not take care against them, and it's okay that they don't. And you can't normally rely when it comes to danger. And by the way, I didn't bring you in the Ramah, I didn't quote. When it comes to danger, we're more machmir than when it comes to isser. For example, if there's milk in your chicken soup or your beef soup or whatever it is, if it's less than a 60th, we're not machmir. But if there's something dangerous, and Chazal considered that fish and meat together was dangerous to your health, then we're more machmir even if it's less than a 60th. Because it's more serious than a prohibition of a pure halachic nature. And this has always been the big question of what we in England used to call Worcester sauce, and what Americans call Worcestershire sauce. I don't know how many you need, either Worcestershire, but it has a little bit of trace elements of fish in it, but it's not technically speaking milchik in any way. And can you have it with meat? Can you not have it with meat? I'm not getting into that now. But he says there are things which are dangerous, but there are other things which are not. V'nira Pasha, third line, the dava de ikka harbe shaloi kasha lehu lebriosam, klum, things which many, many people do and they don't all get sick, or most of them don't get sick. Kagoin harbe mini oichlin, there are so many foods that we eat. She'in shinenim mehem, people enjoy eating these foods, b'yoser, okay? Kabisra, shmeina, like fatty meat, dvarim charifim, maybe alcohol, sharp food, things that people like, okay? But they are dangerous to some people. Some people really get sick because of these foods. There is no prohibition on these foods, and he says, because of the Pasuk Shomer Pesayim Hashem, and he thought in 1981 that smoking fell into that category. He was talking about tobacco. However, when he talked about cannabis, he didn't say that. He said it's osa. Now why? Why didn't he say Shomer Pesayim Hashem? We'll see in a minute what he says on that. This issue of Shomer Pesayim Hashem in 24 is dealing in the Gemara with women who have somewhat of a higher risk of pregnancy, but not a massively high risk. Obviously, if the doctor turns around to a woman who's had a very difficult birth medically and says, you must not get pregnant again, then there's no shaila that that woman is definitely allowed to take birth control, must take birth control in order to prevent some kind of medical emergency if the doctors are telling her. But the Gemara is not talking about that. It's talking about, for example, a young woman or a small stature woman where, it could be difficult for her if she gets pregnant and she has a baby, she's not so big, she can't really deliver the baby so easily, it could be dangerous for her. Don't forget, people used to get married very, very young, 11, 12, 13 in Morocco, etc., even until recent times. And the Gemara says she doesn't have to take birth control because, Shomei Pasayim Hashem, okay, it's a little bit more dangerous. She's a very small, petite woman. But, God protects those. She's going to have a kid. Please God, she'll be okay. Having a child is a very dangerous thing. She has a slightly increased danger. Shomei Pasayim Hashem, it's something that she can do in life without worrying about it. And there are a number of factors that go into this, and I brought you some of those factors. I'll just mention them, briefly. Reb Chaim Ozer Gruzinski said, obviously, how dangerous is it? The more dangerous it is, the less likely we are to say, Shomei Pasayim Hashem. Look at page 7 for a second. The Rav Yaakov Ettlinger said, how imminent is the risk? Meaning, if it's a risk down the line, in 20 years, in 30 years, people who do this are more likely, it's more likely to be permitted. Not always, but more likely. Is it a normal risk? The Gemara number 27, again, I'm not going into detail in this. People, he said, when they go bloodletting, so they only go bloodletting on certain days of the week. They never go bloodletting, says the Gemara, on a Tuesday, or a Friday. Okay, well, you shouldn't do that because, or rather, not that they never do, but it's dangerous to do because of Mars. Mars is ascendant, astrologically, they were concerned about some of these things. So the Gemara says, what about Fridays? Fridays, people tend to do that. Mars is also ascending. He goes, no, dashu berabim. That's what people do this. People have taken this on in society. People do this kind of thing. Normal people, here's the key for us, normal people do this as part of their normal life. Crossing the road is dangerous. But people cross the road? Now, is going skydiving for your 80th birthday a normal thing that people do? I don't know. I mean, when I was a kid, I don't think the 80-year-olds did that. But now 80 is the new 50, and people get sponsored for charity. They jump out of planes. Who knows what they do? So I don't know if it's Osir or if it's Mutter. So the question is it a normal thing that people do? Yeah. Also, I brought you in number 29. What is the gain versus the risk? What are you getting out of it? The Trumas Hadeshen actually says an interesting thing. In number 30, he says that, okay, one second. Shomei Pasayim Hashem. God protects those who are foolish. But if you're not foolish, because you know what all the risks are, then you can't rely on this. This is for people who don't know any better. But once you're already in on the statistics, he says, who says you can rely on that? Okay, that's an interesting idea. But all of that is relevant when we come now into this very famous tshuva in 1973. And let's look at this together for the last 20-something minutes of the shir, because this is really and all the stuff we did up to now is very important because it gives the background. So look at Rav Moshe's tshuva here. Number 31, Isur Ishun Samim, the prohibition of smoking drugs. Okay, Rosh Chodesh Iyar Tavshin Lamed Gimel. So that's 1973. Now, interestingly, the background to this I brought you in the footnotes. There were a number of young bochrim that wrote, a group of Orthodox teenagers wrote shilas to 3 leading poskim in the early 70s, when obviously they were encouraged to get into the kind of 70s culture. And they wrote to Rav Feinstein, they wrote to Rav Emanuel Jacobovitz, and they also wrote to Rav Aaron Soloveitchik. Can we or can we not smoke marijuana? By the way, just to know in brackets, I put you in a footnote earlier, the name marijuana was given to this in the 1920s or 30s. Some people object to it as a racist name because it's based on a Mexican word, and it was all part of the associating Mexican immigrants with danger coming into society. No one would do that anymore, obviously, make that association. That was in the 1920s, not the 2020s. But nevertheless, marijuana was there. Some people object to it. But I'm sure that's now gone away again, and now that we're living in a new world, I think that concern, that woke concern. But he says, Rav...
What's that word mean?
What is the word? It's some kind of Mexican tobacco. It doesn't even mean cannabis. Cannabis is not part of the word cannabis. It's a word which was borrowed because it sounds foreign and dangerous, etc. I'm not getting into that now. So look what Rav Moshe says, number 31. Hini bedava asher hitchilu eize bochrim. There are yeshiva bochrim which have started, may yeshiva la'ashen chashish, marijuana. they've started smoking hashish. Pashad hu dava asa mikama ikre dinim shebatoira. There are many dinim in the Torah which says that this is asa. Chada, and the first of all of them is shehu makalkel umachala etaguf. It's dangerous, and you can't do it because it's dangerous. And Rav Moshe doesn't say shomer pesayim Hashem. In tobacco, even 8 years after this, he said shomer pesayim Hashem. When it comes to smoking weed, smoking cannabis, he says no, we're not going to say shomer pesayim Hashem. He says it's dangerous and therefore it's prohibited. I brought you some of the back and forth. Again, this is a medical question. Is it dangerous? Is it not dangerous? Does it depend on what people are smoking? You should just know that the marijuana that people are smoking in 2025 has 10 times the level of the addictive chemical in it and the psychoactive chemical in it that the marijuana they were smoking in 1973. So they're not talking necessarily about the same thing. You can turn around and say, well, everybody I know got through the 70s just fine smoking marijuana. It's not necessarily. If they can remember the 70s, they probably weren't smoking the marijuana. But it's not necessarily the same stuff. So on the one hand, there are medical benefits, and I listed some of these. And on the other hand, there are real potential dangers, and I listed some of these as well. And therefore, there is a health sort of calculation which needs to be made. And as far as Rav Moshe is concerned, this is not permitted for health reasons. Now, medical marijuana is different. I brought you a piece here from Rav J.D.B. Bleich. I'm sorry I didn't put his name on it. He says here, number 32, Judaism affirms that everything in creation is designed for a purpose. Alleviation of otherwise intractable pain is a known beneficial use of heroin. It's an opioid. Marijuana is effective in alleviating nausea that is a side effect of some forms of chemotherapy, and is still used for that very much. There is every reason to believe that these drugs were given to man for the specific purpose of controlling pain and discomfort. Jewish teaching would enthusiastically endorse legislation legalizing the use with adequate accompanying safeguards of those substances in the treatment of terminal patients. And I brought you from the OU, you just mentioned before the OU, Rav Menachem Gnack, who was the CEO of the OU when this was quoted in number 33. Judaism prioritizes health, encourages the use of medicine designed to improve health and reduce pain. Using medical cannabis products recommended by physicians should not be regarded as a chet, a sinful act, but rather as a mitzvah, an imperative, a commandment. So medical use of marijuana is a very different thing. It's prescribed by doctors. It is used for the purposes of healing. And I brought you a tshuva of the Tzitz Eliezer where he talks about giving morphine to terminally sick patients who are in, God forbid, in terrible pain. And he says, even if there's a risk that the morphine might in some way bring forward their demise medically, since you're doing it for a legitimate medical reason and the alleviation of pain in someone in that level of pain, lo aleinu, is no question that's a legitimate medical benefit. And therefore he's not talking about cannabis, he's talking about of opioids, of morphine, but there's no question that he would apply that to cannabis as well. So I don't think there's any shaila about medical marijuana. If it's done in a proper context with a doctor, that is definitely permitted. But recreationally, says Rav Moshe, I'm sorry, the health risk takes precedence. I actually brought you in the Tzitz Eliezer, which I underlined. He quotes from the Ramban, who of course was a doctor. Nachmanides was a doctor, and he says, look, every single drug can be harmful to some people and helpful to other people. That's the nature of drugs. That they what's that?
You said helpful to some and helpful to others.
And harmful to others. So helpful to some and harmful to others. So the fact that this has positive and negative applications is part of what medication is. So that's the first reason Rav Moshe gives. Danger to health. It does not fall under Shomer Pesayim Hashem. It's at least rabbinically prohibited because of the health concerns. And again, check those out. But the second thing he goes into is mental faculties, which is very interesting. Number 35. And even if there are some healthy people, and it doesn't really endanger them. So let's say you make the medical case and say, no, fine, this is not going to be a problem. People are going to be fine if they smoke this. People take it so they can lose a little bit of the sharpness of what's going on in their mind. And again, there may be medical reasons that becomes a legitimate thing to do, that a doctor prescribes. He's not talking about those people. They don't understand things with the same clarity when they're smoking this substance. Which is even worse. Meaning to mess up your body is bad enough. But to mess up your mind? How can you do that? Apart from that you can't learn Torah properly, karui. You can't daven properly, you can't do mitzvahs properly, because if you do them without a proper mental faculty, with a das haroi, you didn't go keep them at all. Now again, I'm not talking about someone who has so much anxiety that the anxiety itself is preventing them from actually functioning as a Torah Jew. And actually what I might do over, maybe not starting next week, or maybe if I get a chance to do it, I'd like to give a few shirim on mental health issues, because mental health issues have been really looked at a lot more by the poskim. Rav Moshe has looked at it. I'd like to talk about that, because there's a lot to say about that. But he's not talking about someone who is who can't function. He's someone who just likes the feeling of smoking the marijuana. He says, no. Mental faculties are for us everything. And the Rambam, I brought you various halachas, number 36, 37. He says, for us, mental thinking is everything. This is how we connect to God. This is our mitzvahs avas Hashem. If you look in number 37, bisman she'adam mitbaynem b'dvarim elu, when a person thinks about the wonders of creation and the wonders of the spiritual world as well, umake kol habruim mimalach. He thinks about all the creations from the highest angels, the Galgal, and the spheres and the universe, the Adam, and thinks of man, etc. He sees the Chachma of Hashem, b'chala yitzurim, b'chala nivraim, and all the things that were called abruim. And he gets this kind of addiction, but a positive addiction. And this is why I brought this source, that the Rambam is saying that your mind can make you addicted to what you need to be addicted to, which is God intoxication. You're meant to be excited and obsessive in a certain way, in a normal way, but nevertheless. Your flesh is desperate to love God. So it's actually not just a question that you're indulging in other things which are addictive in other ways, is that you're preventing yourself in allowing the real addiction that a Jew should have, which is the addiction to thinking and to chokhmah and to connection with God. It should be something which people are obsessive about in a certain way, and therefore drugs will take you away from this. And therefore he says in number 39, you're not allowed to get drunk. It's poshut. You're not allowed to get drunk on alcohol. It seems very clear, says the Rambam, number 39, when a wise person drinks yayin, you drink in order to help your meal go down. It's something, or for religious purposes, you have a yayin for kiddush or kiddushin, etc. For kala mishtaka, anyone who gets drunk, that's a sin, no question. Anything you do that makes you less clear in your mind is clearly asa. And forgetting your learning is part of that. And I brought you in 40, a source we saw a few weeks ago. Forgetting your learning is a serious, it's almost like a capital crime. And Chazal clarify this in number 41. Rabbi Eliezer, anyone who causes themselves to forget something from their learning. And the Ritva says, Perish, what does this mean? Not that people just forget. We all forget stuff. Nebuch is part of life. You forget. You're not guilty if you forget because people get forgetful. Perish shegorim b'mezid. No, it's if you do something for yourself on purpose. Lishkoyach dava b'talmudi. To make yourself less aware. You chose this. You did this on purpose. Gorim galas lebanov. It's very bad for your children, bad for the family, bad for the Jewish people, etc. So, more so than danger to the body, Rav Moshe Feinstein is worried about anything we do which is dangerous to the mind. And there's no question, the lady said before, that what goes on Purim in all over the world is completely, in the Orthodox world, all of the drunkenness is completely prohibited. There's not even a shaila of any kind at all, and they should drink, maybe a bit more, a bit less. I'm not getting into who should drink and who shouldn't drink, but getting drunk, nobody says that is in a way that you actually lose your ability to perform mitzvahs, etc. That's just a yetzer hara. So that's the second point. Losing your mind is prohibited. And by the way, cannabis can be even worse than alcohol. Alcohol has a certain measured effect. If someone has a sip of alcohol, then it's very unlikely for almost any person to affect them in a significant way. There's a clear level of which you can measure, there are limits, etc. I mean, you may take the view that you're not ever going to drive even if you had a sip of alcohol. That seems like a sensible thing to say. But there are certain levels which are measured, where cannabis is not like that. Depending on the person, they can react to the cannabis in a way which is completely unpredictable. Even a small amount of this could be very, very impactful on the way they see things, and it can stay in the bloodstream for a month. Doesn't take a month to get alcohol out of your bloodstream, but cannabis can, depending on the person, and again, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a medical expert, but these are issues that are talked about. Now, number 42, says Rav Moshe, goes on, V'oid, I give you another reason, Shehu geirin taiva gedola. We have never really talked about this. You're doing something which gives you, you're choosing to do something which gives you more taiva, more addiction, more craving. And by the way, it's interesting, cannabis is used to improve people's appetite, people who are undernourished and need medically, this is one of the treatments that they're given because it increases, it makes you want to eat more, it makes you want to experience more pleasure. Okay? It makes you want to eat more than normal. Like normal amount someone would eat in order just to keep them alive. And there are people who can't control this. There are people who, when they smoke this, it gives them it opens up a world of taiva for them. And this is quite separately a separate. So where's he learning this from? This is extremely creative, very interesting. Shnema, the Ben Sorer Umoira. This boy, the Ben Sorer Umoira. What we see in this boy, even at this young age, whether you say it either happened or it never happened, I'm not getting into that now, is you see somebody who wants to open for themselves all the gates of taiva, of hedonistic life. Even though it's glad kosher. That is not the point. The point is, you can see him opening this lifestyle. You sin in order to bring yourself to this, when you don't need it, you didn't have to do this. That's clearly also. The Avshe Malkus Neima, even though it becomes a Malkus She'ein Unshim in Adin, you don't bring a Kal V'chomer and administer a halachic punishment. You can't say, well, Ben Sora Amora gets this, and this is even worse, and therefore we're going to punish. But that's only when it comes to the Beis Din. We call Makom Le'isura, when it comes to the prohibition, Vadai, over our loves. That's for no question, for sure. If you smoke cannabis, he says, you're basically doing the same thing as the Ben Sora Amora. Very interesting.
Which number in the sheet is
Number 42. And also the addiction of the Ben Sora Amore, which he's linking, will eventually bring him to steal because he won't be able to control it and he needs the substance and he needs it and he'll kill people and he'll basically go completely out of control. That, he said, is the mitzvah of Ben Sora Amora, and you're bringing yourself into that parsha by doing something to you that breaks down these inhibitions. Leaving aside the issue of sexual behavior, then people put themselves in a state where they do things. I mean, Lot is the classic example here, isn't it? That there's all sorts of stuff he'd like to do, but he won't do as long as he's sober, because he's from Avram Avinu's family, so he knows it's wrong. But he'll get himself into a situation where he's basically incapacitated by drink and drugs, and now he'll do all the things he really wanted to do all along. But he said that's also part of what's going on here. I brought you a Kabbalistic source. I brought you also the Shari Tshuva, a more Musa-oriented source in 43 that talks about the need not to actively increase our physical desire. Now, again, we don't have to be monks. We don't have to be ascetics. We're allowed to enjoy the food. We're allowed to have healthy, enjoyable sexual relationships between husband and wife, etc. But when it's being done to indulge, and that's the reason that you're doing it, it's because I can't get enough of it. It says that you're on a slippery slope, and that's not the. It's very hard to do. It's extremely hard to do. Very hard to do, and you have to really, everyone has different taivas in different directions. In number 44, I brought you the Rav Nachman of Breslov, from Likutei Moharan. He says, now all the desires of the body are the aspects of the klipot. If you get into the Kabbalistic cosmology, if you like, of the spiritual world and the physical world of the Arizal, the idea that the kalim that were spheres that were meant to hold the divine light were smashed, and now there's these klipot all around the world which are encasing the forces of kedusha, and these klipot are served by our physical desires. This is because the physical desires are extraneous, since the body could exist without them, etc., etc. And we looked at a couple of those other sources last week that I brought. Rabbi said to his son, don't drink this stuff because it's bad for you. And Rashi says it's bad for you because you'll become addicted, etc., etc. Interestingly, just one last source on this particular section, number 48, So I brought you in 48, there's a Torah prohibition, Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim. The Jewish people are slaves to me, says God, are servants to me. Avadaihem, they are mine. And the Gemara says, Avadaihem, v'loi avadim la'avadim. You can't enable yourself to become a slave to anything else. And that could be work, it could be drugs, it could be your phone, it could be, and that's really hard to do. Once you feel that you're not able to control what you're doing anymore, then you've become an eved to an eved, and that is itself part of this prohibition. And Rav Moshe Feinstein finishes off, having gone through all of those factors, the physical health, the issue of addiction, the issue of taiva, etc. Look at 49, losing one's mind. 49, he finishes, it's a short tshuva. V'oid, sheha'av v'eim shel elo shema'ashnin, the fathers, the parents of these people who smoke, they smoke this stuff. They're very upset that their kids are now part of this culture. And you're breaking kibbud ava'im. You upset your parents in that way. Again, you don't always have to do what your parents say in the midst of kibbud ava'im, but this is very distressing to his parents or hers. There's a mitzvah of kedoshim tiyu, Ramban b'chumash, to go extra, to do, even if it's not technically prohibited, to put yourself in this positive space. And they're causing all these other isurim. It seems absolutely clear, absolutely obvious. This is one of the worst things you can do. You have to try and get rid of this cannabis from the Jewish people. And certainly the bochrim in yeshivas, it absolutely not. Now, one of the things he didn't talk about there, I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to use them just for this, is dina de malchus dina. Is it prohibited in halacha because it's prohibited under the criminal law, let's say, of the land that you're living in? Let's say it's illegal. Now, that's less and less relevant because it's more and more legal, but that's an interesting question. And that is too big a topic to open up now because it really depends. Is it a law that everyone keeps? Is it the law that everyone breaks? How does that work? Dina de malchus dina doesn't relate to every single thing.
This exactly would apply to smoking. It's even more...
Yeah, it could be. It could be. Except, let me just mention this now. I brought you in number 50, an essay written recently by Dr. Baruch Finkelstein. And he addresses actually your point. What's the difference? And he wants to argue, and many doctors have disagreed with this on medical grounds and poskim on halachic grounds. He's a student of Rav Moshe's psakim and shuvas, and he has stuff online on Rav Moshe. He wants to say that Rav Moshe gave so many reasons to prohibit this because he didn't really have a good reason to prohibit it. And the real reason he was against it was because of the counterculture of the 1960s. And it represented something. And he says, and now it doesn't represent that anymore. People who smoked cannabis in the 1970s were rebelling in some sense against the dominant culture. He says, the people who are smoking cannabis here now, he said, are the dominant culture. It didn't do Bill Clinton any harm when he admitted when he was on the presidential race that he smoked cannabis in Oxford, but he didn't inhale, but he smoked cannabis, okay? Didn't harm him. Can you imagine the 1950s, 60s? He would have been finished. Well, you smoke cannabis illegally, you can't be the president. You can't have a president who's a felon or anything like that. And obviously, it didn't make any difference to Bill Clinton, and therefore, there are a lot of people who disagree with this. I brought you at the very end, just on the last page so you can see it. I brought you the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was asked about LSD, which is even more of it. And there's a whole psychedelic revival now going on about mental stimulation. And he says, no, that's not the Jewish way. We don't stimulate ourselves by drugs. We stimulate ourselves by learning and excitement and spiritual highs. I brought you from Rav Steinsaltz, who had a yechidus with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he talked to him about drugs and using drugs, and he said clearly the Rebbe was against it. And let's give the last word to Rav Soloveitchik, number 53. People speak about religious experiences today, trying to stimulate religious experience with drugs of all kinds of acrobatics, while actually engaging in idolatrous practices. One cannot get a religious experience that is a Jewish religious experience without utilizing the materials of halacha. Okay, Rav Soloveitchik got his high from learning Torah. Okay. And it's something that one can do. And therefore, I think it's relatively clear in terms of psakim that most people give, but you can go and ask your local Orthodox rabbi. Again, we talked about medical marijuana as being quite different. Next week, maybe we'll try and get into some of these mental health issues if I can get that done in time, and we'll move on from there. Thank you so much, and we'll leave it there.